And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my floor mate from 8J, who lived in John Jay while they were here. It's after the co-ed years, right? Okay, Merri Rosenberg, class of 78.
So, I thought I knew how to read. But then, in the fall of my senior year, I took Professor Marie Schroeder, the 19th century French novel. I had been a French major totally by accident and by the great good graces and comforting, nurturing, warm, loving bath of professors like René Guin, Tatiana Green, Leroy Brunig, and Serge Gavronsky. Well, Professor Schroeder was a combination of a really, really cold bath and blistering scorn. He was not the typical Barnard professorial experience. His class took place Tuesday, Thursday morning from 9 to 11, the third floor of Millbank Hall. The entire semester, I never ate breakfast on those mornings because my stomach hurt too much. I was terrified of Professor Schroeder, who looked like your stereotypical left bank French intellectual. He was devilishly handsome with dark hair, a really, really good body, a really, really big dark mustache, but he also really, really did not like teaching us. You couldn't come late to class. If you gave an answer that he thought was beneath contempt, he let you know it. And it was a really kind of painful experience to be subjected to that. However, he was worth it because he taught me two amazing things. He taught me to read the white space of a text. That is, he made me confront the concept that every author made a choice, that it wasn't just looking at what the words were that were in the page, what a chapter was, but think about what a writer chose to leave out. What did it mean if someone skipped over a decade or skipped over a whole person's life in, 2 sentences? And that was mind-blowing and exciting, and I kept running around like a kind of stupid little kind of puppy, thinking, God, what an amazing, exciting idea. Whoever thought of this? This is wild. So I was really tedious to people, on my floor on HA saying, wow, did you ever know this? But there was something else that was really profound about Professor Schroeder. This was late 70s. You could still get away here. I know this is very unfeminist, but you could get away with being charming, with flirting, with maybe kind of, being kind of cute in class and hoping the professor would remember that grading your papers and bump it up just a little bit. It did not work with Professor Schroeder because out of all of the professors I have ever had, he specified exactly how our papers were to be formatted. He gave us margins, he gave us spacing. It was 3 pages, no more, no less, and even more than that, our names went on the back of the paper. So as he was reading it and evaluating us, it was totally the power of our ideas and how we expressed them, not whether he loathed us or maybe kind of just tolerated us. Because I did get the sense in class that we were a punishment or a penance for some sin that he had committed. So that was a really amazing idea, to think that you were going to be judged really by your words, and you couldn't get away by personality. It really had to be by your intellect. So I finish at Barnard. I go across the street to get a PhD in French. I abandoned that project after my master's, paid for by Columbia, because it wasn't Barnard. And I go off to do what I intended to do all along, which was to be a journalist. So I realized that Professor Schroeder, I get sightings of him My husband and I lived on 103rd and Riverside, and I knew Professor Schroeder was in the neighborhood because I'd run into him at Sloan's. Remember Sloan's? Okay. So one afternoon, coming back from work, I had by now abandoned huckapoo shirts and corduroy jumpers and Olaf daughter clogs and exchanged them for the nice little baby power suit and pumps and cut my hair. And I'm running up Broadway with my 2 schleppy plastic bags from Sloan's, and I see Professor Schroeder. And I run up there. I say, Professor Schroeder, I have to thank you. Your class completely transformed the way I read, the way I think. Really, it transformed my life. And he looked at me, and he by now had stopped teaching at Barnard, wearing jeans and a black t-shirt. And he looked at me like something really, really unpleasant that the cat had dragged in and just kind of, and kept walking in the opposite direction. What I did not know at that time, this is now the early 80s, that Professor Schroeder had recently come out of the closet as a gay man. It was the beginning of HIV and AIDS. He couldn't do anything other than take care of the people in his community, gay men's health crisis. He had no interest in 19th century French literature or in my gushing. So I worked at that time at McCall's Magazine, one of the late, unlamented Seven Sisters magazines. One of my jobs, besides answering somebody's telephone and typing somebody's letters, was to evaluate manuscripts to excerpt in the publication. So one day, I get a manuscript, and I'm reading it, and it's so great, I miss my stop on the bus going home because it's so wonderful. Go into the office carrying this manuscript like a newborn baby, and I run down to the editor, and I say, this is fantastic. It's just what our readers need. You have to publish it. She looks at me. She doesn't smile. She looks at the author and says, we don't like her. We'll never publish this. And I absolutely staggered. I thought, God, that's not how Professor Schroeder would have done it. That's not how Barnard taught me to be. The world really works like this. It was devastating. It was crushing. So here comes one of my white spaces. Let's fast forward about 2 decades. My husband and I moved to the suburbs. We have our children. I am a freelance journalist. And one morning after I've taken my kids off to school, and I'm about to settle in at my computer to work, the phone rings. And the voice at the other end says, is this the Merri Rosenberg who writes for the New York Times and went to Barnard? I say, yes. He says, this is Professor Schroeder. I say, yes. He said, I'd been thinking whether what I had done as a teacher had any impact on anybody. And I want to thank you for what you said when you caught up with me years ago in the city. He said, would you like to have coffee or lunch someday? Well, of course. I said yes. But of course, it never happened. I had my children, I had my work, I had an elderly mother declining into dementia, and it never happened. About a year later, I heard from a former classmate who still worked at Columbia, and she shared the news that Professor Schroeder had died. And I was heartbroken and stricken, and I had the bitter taste of ashes, of regret in my mouth, just like the end of Flaubert's L'éducation sentimentale that Professor Schroeder had taught me all those decades ago. And I regretted more than anything that last lost coffee and opportunity. I like to think, though, that the way I continue to read, the way I discuss books in book club, even the way I continue to make choices as a writer and as a journalist reflect his legacy. Thank you.